And now I'm particularly excited that we are going to hear from 3 former participants in the USC Libraries Wonderland Award program. I shouldn't even say former participants because it's an experience that sticks with you. And that's what they are all going to discuss with us today. So we're going to begin, there are 3 of them. We're going to begin with AROUSSIAK GABRIELIAN, who earned her doctorate from USC. She also is still with us as an assistant professor of landscape architecture and urbanism in the USC School of Architecture. She's currently working on a book manuscript that emerged from her doctoral research here at USC, which is called Near Extinction Rituals, which aims to help us rethink our interactions with human and non-human agents on this planet, which sounds roughly appropriate for today being Earth Day in one way or another. So thank you very much, AROUSSIAK, for joining us for this, and I will gladly and eagerly turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, and let me share my screen. Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here. Let me go to full screen. Everyone can see okay? All right. So what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about my entry. I was one of the, I submitted in the 2016 version of the awards. So I'm going to walk you through not only what I constructed for the awards, but also the thinking behind it and the kind of process I deployed. And then I'll walk you through some of my current art and creative projects that pull and connect to some of the themes that you'll see brought up in the piece. So the way I start any project is to jump into extensive research. And one of the things that I came across in thinking about what to produce for the Wonderland Awards as the art object was this article in the New York Times, which was actually in the travel section. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but it was in the travel section focusing on Oxford. But what was quite interesting about it is that it was painting the context of the environmental and the architectural and the spatial context that Lewis Carroll was exposed to when writing Alice in Wonderland, and the impact that certain elements had on his creative process. So one of the things, for example, were the fan vaulted ceilings of Christ Church College, looking as though you're underneath a forest of oversized mushrooms, for example. The fireplace in the Great Hall at Christ Church with these brass elements, sculptural elements with the elongated necks that of course translated to some of the storyline that was developed. The garden door that was visible from what would have been Lewis Carroll's library window that featured a kind of miniature sized entryway. This was designed to be the scale of the Liddell sisters, of a child. This is where the Liddell sisters played, and it was the courtyard connecting the cathedral garden to the dean's private garden. And of course, these kind of play with scales and miniaturized elements, of course, ended up in the story as well. The skeleton and reconstruction of the dodo bird at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, the kind of skeletal remains there. So what was really interesting for me as someone who's been trained in architecture and landscape architecture, and at the time that I was making this piece, I was doing my PhD work in the cinematic arts, was this potent catalyst that architectural and environmental elements had in the creative process of storytelling. And to me, I almost wanted to mimic or learn from this process and see if I could go through a similar creative process in coming up with a piece for the Wonderland Award. So what I did was I started to look at various spaces in the USC libraries where the objects that we were constructing would be exhibited for the awards. And I was really drawn by the room, the old card catalog room that's in the library. To me, this was a kind of relic, a preserved piece of kind of obsolete technology that was used, or kind of a system that was used to access the archive of the library. And it's a really kind of exciting space for those of you who have been there. So I was really intrigued by this and wanted to see if there was something I could build that would activate both this space, but perhaps even the elements from this space, if those were able to end up in the piece that I would eventually create. So as mentioned, I was doing my PhD in cinematic arts. So also the thing that came to mind was what cinematic kind of tools I could use to tell the story, or to have a storytelling element embedded in this. And the first thing that came to mind were also these technologies that were storytelling technologies that were also perhaps obsolete. So the first thing that came to mind was the Mutoscope, this kind of proto-cinematic device, a very mechanical method of operating that functions almost like a flip book, where you scroll through various different cards and they reveal an animation or a sequence over time. And I decided, or I kind of put as a question out there, could I construct something similar to this machine using only parts from a card catalog? So I scoured the internet on Craigslist, on Etsy, on eBay to see if I could find old pieces of card catalog systems. And I did. I found this card catalog box. It had a metal divider here that I used as this kind of tab to hold the cards as you spun. You need something that replaces your thumb, if you imagine what your thumb functions as in a flip book. And really constructed this box inside which the card catalog from the Lewis Carroll that were actually housed in the USC library, that one of the curators, Abby Saunders, gave me access to these, and I actually used those to draw on the animation that would be kind of used in this flip book. The only thing that didn't come from a card catalog, but also came from another absolute form of technology, was the gear. This came from an old kind of grandfather clock that's used to kind of wind the clocks. So I put this all together into this object, which was then housed in these pull-up drawers in the card catalog room. And as mentioned, I used the actual cards from Lewis Carroll's collection to draw upon. I used a technique called acetone transfer, whereby you create a kind of drawing and then you're able to transfer that drawing by just rubbing the back of it with acetone. So that's how I was able to create these images on top of these cards that I was given. And the scene that I constructed was a scene through a forest, running through a forest, falling into a rabbit hole, and then re-emerging into a forest. And because the narrative is a looping one in this kind of system, it was important to create a scene that would itself loop. This is showing the kind of process of cranking the machine and the scene that would unfold as you worked this machine. And one quote that I also acetone transferred onto the machine was this from Lewis Carroll himself: begin at the beginning and go on till you come to the end and then stop. This is done in his handwriting that I transferred onto the machine. And what I found quite ironic here was that, of course, in a looping narrative, there is no beginning and end. And so there was this kind of playful kind of ways somehow wound up being integrated into the experience of interacting with this piece. The USC Libraries made a little video, and this is showing you how the piece works. It'll loop again. I know it's very quick. So you turn the handle and the animation kind of unfolds as the cards flip inside of it. So that was my entry. And I just want to kind of orient you into other creative works that I engage in, and end with one that connects perhaps most I don't know, has the strongest connection to the ideas explored in the piece that I showed. Usually I work with natural systems, biological materials, my work really engages the biophysical world and uses technology to amplify our experience of the biophysical world. This was a piece done for a garden in Métis, Canada. These are listening pods. Imagine them as oversized speakers, occupiable speakers in the landscape. And I used biosensing electrodes. These are very sensitive sensors that you put that could collect frequency and energies within living systems. So if water is moving up a tree, you would actually hear what that sounds like, or insects kind of breaking matter apart in the soil. You would pick up the energies and frequencies from those sounds, convert it into sound, and bring it back into this speaker, so that you're able to actually experience the dynamic qualities and the dynamic nature of the biophysical world. I called it interspecies opera because there were also microphones embedded in the earth, where the human could also leave their voice behind. So in a way, this piece is giving voice to the forest and allowing the human to almost, quote, sing with it in a kind of sound envelope. This is showing the layout of where these speakers were placed in the garden and the experience of inhabiting them with others amidst the volume of the forest. This was done for a competition where it was we were named finalists. We didn't make it to the final where you get, we didn't win, which would have given us the money to construct this, but I'm still kind of looking at other opportunities to find funding to build this, because I think it'll be quite exciting to be inside of these. Another piece similarly themed was done in collaboration with a musical composer, Suzanne Farren. The constructed piece is what you're seeing behind her, this disc of a translucent screen that is put around the fountain at the American Academy in Rome. And here, the concepts that I wanted to kind of bring forth was the animate and dynamic quality of water, and particularly the way in which different kinds of instruments would impact and agitate the water differently based on both the kind of sonic profile that each of these instruments had, but also the muscular act of making music. Each of these requires different kinds of stroking. And so we devised this kind of analog machinic system where we connected the musician's arms with this bracelet that connected to the system that dropped a heavy object into the water. So every time they moved their arms to play their instrument, the water would be agitated, and the high frequency lighting would actually project that agitation onto the screen. Here I'll give you a sense of what that looked and sounded like very briefly. Not sure you can hear. Oh, here we are. So as they played, as the musicians played, the water was agitated depending on what instrument was playing, and the agitation of the water reflected that turbulence of the surface of the water onto the surface of the screen. Okay, so I know I'm going through these quickly, happy to, because of time, but happy to talk about these in the Q&A. I want to end with something that perhaps connects most strongly with what I showed for the Wonderland. This was a project we were funded by the Provost Initiative in Arts and Humanities Arts in Action Grant, which supports work that USC faculty do with community groups. So here we were collaborating with LA Commons, which is a community organization working with youth artists, the Willowbrook Inclusion Network, LACMA, LA County Parks and Rec, and LA County Arts and Culture, to think about ways of developing co-design processes with the community of Willowbrook, which is in South Los Angeles, to allow them to think about the future of memorials and memorial making, and allow the community to come up with ways of telling their own stories and commemorating narratives that they feel strongly about. So for this, we devised these boxes, these viewing boxes, within which we placed objects from community artists and community activists. So here you're seeing Charles Dixon's sculpture, Lana. He's a sculptor that works and lives in the area. Dominique Moody's Nomad 44. She's an assemblage artist that cut together different pieces of license plates and constructed this piece that spelled out Nomad. And Rose Pinkney, who's a community activist that developed the community gardens in Willowbrook, she picked a bunch of bay leaves from her garden. We brought these objects to life using sound and using projection mapping. The sound was from interviews we conducted with each of these artists, where we asked how the context of Willowbrook, how the neighborhood, how the community influenced their artwork and their art process. And so as these were set around in various locations in Willowbrook, you were able to listen to the interviews while watching these pieces come to life through light, through color, through text. These were used for community engagement efforts. So the community viewed these, and then there was a process of engagement where youth artists talked to community members about what they got, from that process of viewing these things, from listening to these stories, what they wanted to commemorate in their neighborhoods. And then they took, the youth artists took this material from the community members and created these beautiful drawings that summarized some of the things that were talked about in these meetings. And then our group as designers took their art pieces and wrapped these almost large-scale cylinders with the artwork that was created by the community youth artists. And these were displayed at various locations in the Willowbrook neighborhood. And here, some of these were also activated through augmented reality. So some of these maps, for instance, you could access archival maps that were generated in the production of these drawings. And we were actually funded for a second round of this to develop this, the digital archive a bit further in collaboration with USC Libraries and the Willowbrook Library. So this is what we'll be working on from end of the semester to I think the funding is 9 months, I believe. So we'll be working on this, on developing this piece in the future. But to me, the viewing boxes and these kind of proto-cinematic, machines that are constructed to tell a particular story about a place, about an environmental context, were probably the themes that I pulled from the Wonderland Award submission that you saw earlier. That's it. I'm sorry, I probably went over time, but I'll stop share.
No, you're all good. So folks, please share your questions or raise your hand. In the meantime, I mean, can you elaborate a little more on because so much of the work you shared is about storytelling and pretty ways that are obviously somewhat removed from text or explicit cinema as you might think. So can you just elaborate a little bit about how your sort of experience with the playfulness or the nonsense or the kind of Lewis Carroll approach to telling stories in the world has informed your thinking over the years?
Yes, I think there's something to the kind of using prompts as catalysts for an imaginary, for kind of activating our imaginary, is something that came out in the object that I had designed for the Wonderland. And something that I saw in his process, as was outlined in that article that I came across about Oxford. There was so much power in seeing architectural or environmental kind of prompts or seeds that then kind of created a world, a story world around them, each one kind of acting as a catalyst or as a seed in that creative process. So to me, that was perhaps the most exciting thing that, again, as someone who was trained in architecture and landscape and in kind of storytelling techniques used in the cinematic arts, it wasn't so much that it wasn't so much for me that it was cinematic or kind of text-based, but rather that things in our everyday lives could become a seed for these kind of world-building efforts, whereby we construct entire imaginaries around these objects. And the last work that I ended with does a similar, does this with community members in a similar way, whereby we showed little pieces of, whether sculpture or kind of found objects, and really brought them to life and allowed the community members to really think about their everyday context and how it might, and the kinds of stories that they might want to tell for their own community, for those who are outside of the community, kind of visiting. So it's probably more of the process that was identified that I was kind of drawn to mostly.
Cool, thank you very much. That was a great answer. Really appreciated that. We have a request for you to share your website in the chat. So if you don't mind, and I also just from someone who's works and lives a great deal of time in the library, I really appreciate your approach to using the card catalog in that, because it wasn't the typical fetishization of the sort of just the old beautiful card catalog, and it was sort of transforming it in an unexpected way. So thank you for transforming that somewhat the usual preciousness of old library objects. So thank you for that. So I think what we'll do is sort of have a little bit of individual questions with each one, and then maybe all three of our presenters together after we see them all. Maybe we'll have questions for all of them as a group. So we're going to move on next to Genevieve KAPLAN, also a PhD and USC graduate, is a poet, has a couple books of poetry along with several chapbooks. Most recently, I Exit the Hallway and Turn Right, which she described as an anti-ode to office work. So maybe Genevieve can elaborate on that for us a little bit. She lives in Southern California and edits the Toad Press International Chapbook series, which publishes contemporary translations of poetry and prose. So please welcome Genevieve KAPLAN.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I'm going to go ahead and try to remember how to share my screen, no matter how many times I Zoom. It is new every time, so give me just a minute. Okay. Here we go. And then push this. And I do this. Okay, great. Here we are. So in preparing for today's talk, I also looked back onto my Wonderland Award entry to sort of see where I was and remind myself about what I am interested in. And that is namely poems, concepts, book objects, and particularly the combination of these things. So today I will show you some of my recent projects, which I've selected with an eye toward how I've been approaching poems, concepts, and book objects in unusual or surprising, or even, I would say, I venture this, Carolian ways. So for a little bit of background, this is my 2010 entry into the Wonderland Awards, and this is called Alice's Alphabet. And it is a small book. It consists of 2 poems that are comprised of Lewis Carroll's lines in my home copy of Alice in Wonderland that I reordered and then bound into book form. So both poems here use the structure of the alphabet to create a kind of playful rereading. The first poem is called Alice's Alphabet, an Explanation, which collects all the phrases that begin with the word Alice and then uses the next letter in the sentence to generate an alphabetical journey. So I will read the section F, it's kind of short, just to give you a sense of how it works. So this is F. Alice felt a little irritated at the caterpillars making such very short remarks, and she drew herself up. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. Alice felt so desperate that she was ready to ask help of anyone. Alice felt that this could not be denied, so she tried another question. Alice folded her hands and began. The second poem in the book is called Alice's Alphabet, Alex Explains, and it reconstructs a similar itinerary through Lewis Carroll's book, but this time using all the sentences that begin with the word I, so sentences in which Alice herself is speaking. And then I bound the book dos a dos, which is back to back, so that the two poems share the same cover, but the book can be opened on either end. So I'd always been interested in book arts, and I have a background in letterpress printing and bookmaking. I'd taken some classes in these things during my undergrad and also my MFA program. But Alice's Alphabet was the first sort of more playful conceptual book that I'd created. And also making Alice's Alphabet reminded me that I didn't need a printing press or fine paper to create these kinds of fun objects. I could just use the things that I had at home. So for Alice's Alphabet, I used cardstock. Actually, it's scrapbook paper, double-sided scrapbook paper. You can buy that pretty much anywhere now. And I printed out the language inside using just like regular printer paper in my printer. And then I pierced the binding with a needle and bound the book with thread. So it was pretty simple. And I will show you a few more of my other recent projects. So this is Community Chest. It is a small, it's like 2x3 deck of cards that's meant to be held and shuffled and reread to create new and different combinations of hand-printed phrases that lead to new poems and new understandings. So the cards, here's one of the cards, are a collection of iterations, questions, possibilities, and responses meant to rub up against each other and change with each encounter. So the phrases or lines are stamped on. I used a return address stamper that had interchangeable letters. So I like hand set the type for each of those cards. And my idea here was that readers could reshuffle the cards and get a new poem every time they read through. And another project is Chance Operations. This is a small pocket book. It's called a pocket book because it literally has pockets. You can see the pockets in that second image. Also, it would fit in your pocket. It's like 2 by 3 inches essentially. So it is a small book that I created using cardstock, paper, photographs, and some found text. So this small book features images of myself and my coworker, that's Emily with the hat. And we are both fans of John Cage's writing and we were coworkers. So I used some of Cage's text about work. So some of the text here, which can move from pocket to pocket, you can see how it can kind of come out and go back in, includes lines like, if something is boring for 2 minutes, try it for 4, or my work will change myself. This next slide shows a piece that's in progress. Like I'm not quite sure where it's going yet, but I'm excited about it. So I thought I'd share. This is a piece that also uses found language. So a friend of mine had read my astrology chart a while back. And of course I kept it because I was like, this is meaningful. It's going to help me in some ways. And so I kept it, but because of that, but also I found that I was really fascinated by the language that she was using in order to describe my future. So I took a couple of these phrases. These are just a few that I pulled out. The future is complicated, and on the purple, there's a clear whisper. So I pulled some of these phrases and I stamped them in silver ink on this sort of colored translucent vellum. So my thought here so far is that they look really pretty, and I'm interested in seeing what they might become. So as you can see from the work that I've shared so far, I'm interested not only in like the poem or poetic language, but I'm also interested in the presentation of that language. And I'm interested in the potential for interaction between the book and the reader. I'm also interested in putting poems or poetic language in unexpected places and considering how that placement changes the encounter that people will have with it. So I'm also interested in creating things that appear off the page or not on a typical page as well. So this is Here's Love, which was a site-specific poetry installation that went up in Pasadena in 2017. And for here, I selected lines from my poem, which was called Here is Love. And then I sewed them onto these orange jute ribbons. And then I pinned the lines to the arms of a cactus. So this sort of visual and tactile experiment was exciting in that it encouraged viewers and readers to have an encounter with the poem in a way that they might not have expected. So the cactus was really tall, like 20 feet tall. So it really loomed over people. And so readers had to sort of physically move their heads or bodies to read a line and then move around a little bit to read the next line. It was also neat to see, so it was just up for a day, but it was neat to see how the colors of the poem changed as the sun moved across the yard and some of the lines got brighter or darker, that sort of thing. And the other thing that was exciting is how innocuous seeming phrases from the poem, like pincushions or biting lilies, took on kind of new and charged contexts when they were juxtaposed with the prickly spines of that cactus. So similarly, these flag flowers, that's what I like to call them, place lines of a poem among the blooming poppies of my front yard. So in this instance, the viewer has to get really down low to read. For this project, I sewed words onto construction zone flags, you know, those little flags that workers or gardeners use to mark where not to dig. And then I planted them in the ground. So the flags themselves are like 3 to 4 inches. I'm also engaged and always engaged, I think, in the concept of a broadside, which is typically like a finely made letterpress object, often framed to hang on a wall as a way to present a poem. So as I sort of mentioned earlier, I don't have a letterpress or access to a letterpress anymore. But so I thought about like what I do have, and typically things I have around my house, because I'm crafty, are like needle, thread, paper, bits of things. So this one here, Please Bend, is a framed poem. It's about 5 by 7. The frame is about 5 by 7 that I created using a thrifted picture frame. And then I sewed words onto handmade orange paper that I had some leftover of. This one, Isn't It Winter, is, again, I used a picture frame, but I used the picture frame as a frame to create a weaving. So I guess I warped the frame, and then I wove in some paper bits of, this is an image, it's a landscape image from an old calendar that I had that I sort of cut into this wave formation. So I wove in the paper, and then I wove some more thread in the bottom, and then I sewed some text on top of it. So this one is about 10 by 12. And then those smaller pieces I just showed you are sort of extensions of an earlier, more involved project that I've been working on for a while. So back in 2017, I started creating a series of what I like to call woven broadsides. So what I was doing was sewing and weaving poems into these sort of fuzzy, tactile, and I hope sort of beautiful pieces that could hang on a wall as art as well as be read. So these are some of the images. These are some images of the series of woven broadsides. The language in these broadsides comes from poems in my book Aviary, which was later published in 2020. And I created these woven broadsides by first sewing each poetic line onto a ribbon. So I embroidered the letters and words and phrases onto a thin ribbon, and then later I wove the ribbons, the lines of the poem together on my table loom. So the embroidered lines combine with the yarn and other threads to create a larger piece of material. In this case, it's a poem composed of lines that are physically connected. So let me also just say that like the poems that I write, I know I haven't really read you any, but the poems that I write are not like these like bam, powerful, wacky over the head, I totally get it on first read kind of poems. So the poems that I tend to write take a little bit more time. And in particular, the poems in Aviary that are on these broadsides are kind of slow and dense and multi-sensory. So I wanted to, through this broadside project, kind of encourage readers to linger a little bit on an image or a line, to come back to the poem again and again, to have a different type of reading experience. This is a picture of the framed broadside. Sorry, it's kind of dark, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how it looked all together. So the frame is like 24 by 36. So that's about how big it is. And while these broadsides are very visual, the sewn letters are only about 1/4 of an inch high. So readers really need to like get up close to the poem in order to read it, which is something that I think is cool. So the size invites the reader to get closer, to really examine the threads, to see the fuzziness of the weft, the not quite straight lines of the warp, the way the words of the poem pull at the warp and give it a little bit of movement. So the invited reading, I hope, when someone encounters this piece, is not just of text, but also of texture. So the reading experience is kind of verbal and visual and also tactile. So let me read you a part of this poem that we've been looking at. So this is from my book, Aviary. I'm just going to read you the last stanza, but some of the words are pictured here, so you can kind of follow along, but you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. So this poem is called Shift Up and Down the Wires That Close Them In. Which green was what I heard out in the yard, the fracture of a branch or step, small movement of the night glancing toward the laundromat, the cartridge, electric types of noises through the foliage, and someone coming closer, some movement not so distant, as the order is the thing, the archiving of the thing, the crickets and their pledges in the lost circle of black-green, jungle there at the shape of it, for the shape near the trunk and the dirt of it, seemingly lost or broken fast to be unrecognizable. The main thing is to take the time, not near enough a breeze or a tree motion, the night which shadows on and lingers on. So through this project, this like woven broadside project, I was also really interested in emphasizing slowness, so that the slow act of writing and thinking, of sewing and weaving these poems, but also the sort of time and lingering that I hoped would happen for readers when they encountered the poem in this format. So I wanted to end here on this sort of more playful note, coming back around to this idea of like more Carolian type of play. So here for this project, I used a literary constraint. So specifically the N+7 technique was my inspiration. And these pictured here are, I would say, functional rather than decorative art. So they're what I've decided to call constraint-based woven poetry coasters. So basically here I weave the coasters and then I sew the words onto the woven material. So the words aren't actually woven in like the broadsides were. And here the first phrase, which is wine glass, I was trying to evoke physically like what you would set upon the coaster, like you would use this coaster while you're drinking wine. So that is my first phrase. And then I followed, well, sort of loosely followed the N+7 technique, which was created by Jean Lescure of the Oulipo, which what he suggests is you take a dictionary, you look up your noun, that's the N, and then you count 7 down to the next noun, and you replace your noun, wine, with the next noun, wish. So that's the idea there. And of course, I didn't follow that guideline precisely because these coasters, they're like 4x4, they're coaster size. And you can see that basically I had to only use words that are like 5 letters or less, otherwise they wouldn't fit. And I also was interested in using words that would make me smile. Like, I think this is funny. I don't know if you think it's funny, but I think it's funny. So I was interested in like having that kind of, I don't know, witty, dark humor in here. So here, the words wine glass becomes wish globe, which becomes witch glow, which becomes woe glue. So let me end here on that note. And thank you so much for your time and letting me share a little bit about what I've been working on.
Thank you so much. Thank you in particular for leaving us with woe glue. I wonder if, because you mentioned at the beginning, you kind of, you're sort of thinking about the book as art, kind of, or sort of book arts. And you incorporate, there's writing, of course, but there's sewing and there's weaving, there's adapting the physicality of a cactus as a type of book. So I wonder if you can maybe just like think for a minute, like what is the through line through all of those forms that kind of connects your approach to the book as a piece of art?
I think, well, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately, because I've been trying, so I've been invited to submit for this book art show, and I've been really daunted by it because I'm like, I'm not a book artist, I'm something else. And so I've been really trying to think about like, what is that something else that I am? And I think like what I am really excited about is I'm generally excited about text, like I'm very excited about language. I'm also very excited about concept. Like I like thinking through what the possibilities are, what the possibilities of movement are. And so I think that the materials are interesting to me. Like I'm always interested in material, but they're not the most important thing to me. And I think that that is the distinction that I would make between myself and maybe other artists who are working in similar mediums is like, I love material, but for me, the most important part is the text. And then the concept is also like almost always equally as important. So that's also what I would say is probably the through line in these things is they are all sort of tracing what the text and the context, the concept might be.
Cool. Thank you very much. That was terrific. So we have one more sort of where are they now? Participants from the USC Libraries Wonderland Award, and that is STYLÉS AKIRA, who received his MA and PhD from the USC Annenberg School, where he worked on strategic branding and marketing, mass media effects, semiotics, and behavioral economics. So we have a whole polymathic array of interests there at USC. He also serves on the graduate faculty as a lecturer in the Master of Communication Management and Digital Media Management programs currently at Annenberg. And as if that's not enough, also runs a full service marketing startup called the Annie Agency, which approaches marketing strategy by the principle of positive deviance, which I suspect he might explain a bit about what that is to all of us. And if I'm correct, I believe STYLÉS entered the Wonderland Award 4 times. Is that right? Like 2012, 2015, something like that. Yeah. So a lot of engagement with the award, with the collection. So please join me in welcoming STYLÉS AKIRA to share with us for a bit. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. If I hadn't written it at Neil's request, Tyson's request, I wouldn't think it was me. You make it sound better than it looks on paper. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen really quick. You should be able to see now. So this is really long, and don't worry, there's some parts that I'm just going to breeze through, and there's some parts that we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about. But how I'm going to start this is, I'll talk about my entries into the Wonderland Awards, and there are 4 different years that I entered. So there won't be much time to elaborate, but I have links, and I can share out this presentation if needed. And I'll just briefly go through those, and then I'll talk about the agency that I founded and how Lewis Carroll has come in to influence a lot of the creative principles that we use to do some of the strategic work that we do in terms of branding, marketing strategy, and things of that nature. And then finally, as I'm also equal parts an academic teaching at USC, I'll inform how the work of Lewis Carroll has, influenced the process that we take at that agency, because many of the agents that work for me are former students of mine from the programs at USC. So it's just an overview to give you a brief insight about what we're about to go through. My first entry was called The Portraits from the Gallery of the World House Hearts. It used a bunch of different techniques. Primarily, it was based out of acrylic on canvas, but then I used real world objects to bring the paintings to life. You see here, we have the Queen of Hearts, and each piece was accompanied by a short poem. This one was the Queen of Hearts and Meanest Arts, a temper tantrum through. In fact, not only once did she, but off both hinges flew. The knave loathed every word she said, the king dared pierce his crown. Off with his head, she screamed as all the numbered hearts spun round. And this is just speaking to the notion of the Suicide King. And you see here at the bottom of the page, the Suicide King is the King of Hearts, who has the sword piercing behind his head, but it looks as though it's piercing through his head. And you see the Queen has written Hearts upon the Knave of Hearts, named him the Knave of Hearts, no longer the Knave of Hearts, because she was angry at him for some reason or another in the story I wrote. It's a long time ago, but and I had the same type of concepts going again and again. This was an illustration of Alice, which used images from the actual Wonderland books as the background, and then torn away, you can see on the left side is a segment that's taken from the previous painting's background. Above this is from the following paintings, and also from the Tweedledee and Tweedledum to that, and then sections from her own, right? So again, there's a short poem accompanying. I'll read the shorter poems, where the longer ones tend to be more dense, so we'll just keep flowing on those. But the little girl, gone to and fro to Wonderland she came. The little girl believed in us, in her we did the same. Through rabbit hole and looking glass, she passed to play the game. How sensible a little girl, and Alice was her name. So there's an elaborate artist statement that accompanied this, but again, I don't have time to go into all of that, but there's a poem and explanation of why she's posing this figure, why the dress was yellow, and all of the references to Lewis Carroll's stories, and we're taking like comparisons to the Disney version where Alice appears in blonde, but the original Alice the Bell was actually a brunette. So things all across the board, and you can also see that the ribbon here is also actual ribbon. It's affixed to the painting, not actually illustration. This one of the four in this collection was my favorite. This was Humpty Dumpty, and the name of the painting was Pompous Circumstance. And this was taken from actual eggshells. If I were to zoom in, you would be able to see the cracking eggshells. And these appear on my website, which I can also share a link to. And really, it was just a reconfiguring of Tenniel's illustrations of Humpty Dumpty, where Humpty the anthropomorphic egg, his entire body is the shape of an egg, and it was Lewis Carroll's way of mocking literary critics who saw as pompous and arrogant and wanting to control more of the world than they had the ability to. And I took that notion of the egghead and took it to a different level by making the anthropomorphic egg with a human body with the actual egghead, so it has a proper spine. It doesn't have much of a neck, but he has a neck somewhere in there. And you see he's fallen from his wall and cracked his skull once again. The eyes were made out of acrylic medium, but it was a transparent medium that dried with a bit of whiteness in it, and it gave them a glassy effect. If you ever saw the real painting, you could get the full depth of that. But again, just trying to give the illustrations and the paintings texture. So with the eggshells and the condensed acrylic for the eyes, just trying to bring it all together and then accompany it with a literary piece in the form of the poem. And finally, we have the brothers keepers, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. And I think in the poem there, or the story, they were serving as emissaries for the King of Hearts or something of this nature. And they had come from a voyage and they fell asleep in their favorite tree in the royal courtyard. So here they are with their spinning caps and their matching outfits. Again, their ribbons are actual ribbons. I think the canvas I placed, on the canvas I placed sand from, because it was USC Wonderland Awards at the Henry Library. So I used sand that was taken from Santa Monica Beach and placed in the background to give the tree its texture and the entire painting a sense of texture and give it more depth. So here you see them falling asleep and one glance at the other, and the poem read, the brothers Tweedle took a rest in lieu of war that started. Once Crow had fled and Alice sped to slumber, soon they parted. Before they did, Dee said to them, away into the deep. The twin agreed, and soon indeed, his head fell on Dee's cheek. Dee glanced before his arm wrapped around the shoulder of the sleeper. For Tweedledee and Tweedledum, each one his brother's keeper. So the name of this one was Brothers Keepers. And that was my first Wonderland Awards entry. And also accompanying this in the written portion was the genealogy of Humpty Dumpty and the brothers Tweedle. So you had Eeny, Meeny, Miny, and Mo, and Hickory, Dickory, and Dock. Dock was the ancestor of Lady Swan, who was formerly known as the Ugly Duckling, who gave birth to Duck, who also married Duck. Duck had a child named Mother Goose. Mother Goose gave birth to Twiddle and Lumpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty married Humpty Dumpty and gave birth to Humpty Dumpty. I believe Humpty's original last name before marriage was Humpty, so it's Humpty married to Humpty Dumpty. And then Twiddle married Twaddle Doddle and had Twiddle Oo. Twiddle Oo married Twiddle I, and they had Tweedledoo. Tweedledoo married Tweedledee, and they had Tweedledee and Tweedledum. So you get the whole nonsense of Lewis Carroll and going on and on like this. And there are in-depth explanations of how all of the jokes and the puns are layered within the stories, but there's just, wouldn't be time within the scope of this presentation to elaborate on all of this. The second entry was the Duchess of Wonderland, which was also accompanied by a short story. You see the equations for, I think it was a wormhole or a black hole written on the Duchess's face. And in the story, the main character picks up this sculpture, and it plays a key role in the protagonist reaching his end. But a lot of it was, just to take an analysis and an in-depth look at Lewis Carroll's representation of the Duchess and her hideous face and all of the things that represents with the oversized head and the violence involved in all of this, as opposed to Western European Victorian era standards of beauty and also universal standards of beauty. They just have to do with things like the positioning of features, for instance, cheekbones, eyes, ears, nose, lips, and chin, right? And how all of these played in the calamity and the comedy of the Duchess in the Wonderland play. The third entry was called Of Senselessness and Nonsensibility. It was a combination of stories, and it again these are all original pieces, but they take from the Lewis Carroll stories by incorporating characters from those stories and part of the world building that Carroll had extensively done into the stories that are being presented here. So here you have the illustration of the Lunatic Cavalcade. There were basically two major parts to the story. I think it was 4 stories that were divided into 2 parts. And it started similar to Alice's Wonderland stories with narrative of real life events, supposedly in this imaginary world, in the real world side of things. And then the children went to sleep after their father had told them the story of how he battled Filthy McCracken and the pirates. And they woke up in this wonderland where they encountered similar circumstances, but all the characters were animals and anthropomorphic beings, things of that nature. There were stories within stories, poems, short plays with stage directions, all these were incorporated into this. So it's like very extensive. It's hard to get into the details, but just to give you an overview of some of the stuff that I work on. I'll just read an excerpt from this. Now let's get down to it. Where's the goat? Cried Rupert. Rupert was the father, Rupert Scuttlebury. Gold, what gold? We have in our hands any gold in 6 months. And counting, replied McCracken. That would be Filthy McCracken, the pirate. And then he goes on, telling me, you know what gold, McCracken? 'Twas the gold you stole from Evonshire en route to the Rogers. The Rogers had lost their marbles in another chapter. They didn't know that they had marbles to lose, so the queen insisted that they be gifted giant barrels of pearls and had them sent, which were intercepted en route by Filthy McCracken and his band of pirates. So we go on and on like that. And then the final submission that I did was called Wayward Fool. It had to do with, again, in Carrollian themes, our understanding of sanity and madness. And it characterized an individual who had gone through an experience where he lost his mind. And in that process, he came to find himself on a deeper level. And he affixed himself to a band of vagabonds in the process and met wonderful comrades. He had fantastic adventures. I'll just read this short excerpt for you. For I have seen the souls of men change, weary with discontent. Whether this shall be my fate remains still to be determined. But in their eyes, there lies the heavy burden of desperation, the lust for things uncanny, savage craving for acceptance, and a safe return to the realm of commonplaces. These are the ambitions of the insane. But for love, a man will suffer dire feats. And where he goes, he ends up, so it bears repeats. Like a madman chasing shadows in the street. Like a madman chasing shadows in the street. And here again, once more, a section, once more the red light began to glow as its soft crimson warmth radiated from the surface of the distant floating mass. Fading amber, now its yellow brilliance danced upon their sleeping faces in its full glory. These will be the vagabonds sleeping in the street. Resplendent with twinkles, the bastion of wealth apart from the savagery that lay beyond its outer realm. Dark and cold, where wild things loomed and mystery escaped, and sanity and the greater good had come undone. The spawn of iniquity rose up from those shadows, chastised by the inklings of nevermore, and sank into the infinite abyss where reflection ceased, and the winds of every storm lay wait in the mouth of oblivion. The madman rages in his illusory plight. So those were my Wonderland submissions. And those are inspirations for much of the work that I do in the current day with the agency that I founded, the Annie Agency, which was designed to be a new type of agency with a new way of thinking and seeing things. The core principles upon which it was founded was to change the conversations that people are having around various subjects, whether it be creative, social, political, cultural, and things of that nature. So, you know, we have a philosophy that we follow, which is reconsideration of common perceptions and gaining competitive advantage through the ability to see flaws in the system and our willingness to diverge from accepted norms. And the concept of positive deviance, again, is one of our core tenets, which was essentially, it revolves around the notion of taking what you have and basically bootstrapping is the way to put it, and doing things that are uncommon with your limited resources in order to create opportunities that are unforetold, right? And we use this to disrupt traditional models, impart with assumptions, and leave conventions to imitators, and initiate new approaches to market activity through positive deviance and using current resources to make ideas come to life through pure ingenuity. We position ourselves as a socio-cultural movement, house, and creative marketing company. So our mission is to disrupt markets left, right, and center, and we aim to change the way that things are done by first changing the way the world is understood. So it's just a reconsideration of all things that we take in every single project that we work on. You know, we seek to change the narrative, take leadership, and outmaneuver imitators in that way. And we base it strongly on theory and all of the capabilities that we provide. Our process from market research to brand development, campaign development, business development, and consulting, which are services that we all provide, media strategy, testing, and execution, all based on this. Now I'm going to go super zoom to make sure that we have enough time for everything else. But in practice, we've done this for different projects. This is Black MP's Living Waters campaign. We use Rorschach blots. Again, a historical reference, which kind of was inspired by Lewis Carroll, constantly taking references from real life and then implementing them into the creative realm. So here we have the Rorschach ink blots because the water is black, fulvic, and humic acid infused water. We took the Rorschach ink blots and used that as a form of artwork to demonstrate the nutrients that have benefits for brain function, right? We did the same thing with Jackson Pollock just to play on the Black theme with his flash methodology, and we proposed a partnership with his estate for that campaign. And then we have all of our, creative realm where we apply these types of products to different spaces where they can serve as advertisements other than the conventional spaces. So, this is something that's commonly done in the sports, especially extreme sports. So we saw it as an opportunity for the brand to connect. Taking world tours, national tours from coast to coast, putting on the side of the shipping. And then this was a different campaign that we do for USFHP, Uniformed Services Family Health Plan. It's a TRICARE Prime servicer of armed service personnel who are retired in military families. And these are social media posts that we produce for them. Again, trying to use creative elements that the part you see here, floral arrangements are used to construct the female anatomy for recognition of endometriosis awareness, right? And, just taking the same types of strategies and going back and forth, being whimsical and playful in the things that we create, and trying to have a sense of originality in everything that we produce, but rooting it in some philosophical paradigm that's based in a set of principles that are largely guided by Carolian thinking. We go on and make merchandise and promotional items for our clients. This was one that we did for the Raiders for their move to Las Vegas. We, again, taking historical figures and applying the brand identity. Leif Erikson, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, right? And then we do these, we have to mock them up in real world. Can't all be fun and fantastic narratives, right? There have to be some KPIs and numbers that have to be crunched at some point. But we take a both theoretical, a creative, and a practical sense to all of the work we do. And here, just having fun, this was a concept that we developed for NBC Universal's research department when we introduced Tell Feather Scores. And we had the 6 C's of media usage: critique, channels, connection, consumption, comparison, and culture. And this is all the use of alliteration and, the naming of each and using that and embedding it into the NBC Peacock are just all kind of things that I'm just trying to show you are informed by my sense of Carolianness, if you will. And then finally, getting down to the super fast forward portion, and I'll do the next 50 slides in 5 minutes. This next section just deals with the process in our thinking, right? We start with research and we ask, what is research? We research the market, our audiences and brands and products. We use metrics, data, and analytics. Metrics being the parameters for the data that we collect, data being the sets of numbers and calculations, and analytics being the patterns that we can discover in those numbers. And then we use those to create insights, which are discoveries that are relevant, actionable, and previously unrealized. So we have metrics, data, analytics, and insights. At the Annie Agency, we take it a step further, and we have all of these fun ways of framing these types of research and data collection processes. So we do trend hunting, we do immersion, where we call it getting smart. We do window shopping, where we go outside and by hook or by crook, we look at everything that can be informative to the strategy that we're trying to develop. We do spectral analysis, which is very Carolian in the sense that it represents a sense of palindrome where we have extremes on both sides. So if we were to say, what is the future of sneakers? Well, there could be one future where the sneaker is invisible and it's just something that goes in the bottom of your foot and protects your foot at all times. On the other end, it could be something extremely clunky or antiquated, like the dad shoe, right? Which is very popular among luxury brands at the current moment. The law of entropy, meaning that things can always be different, and our goal is always to be different, but different is only correct when it's in the right direction. So there are a million ways for a piano to be shredded into a wood chipper and come out and it's still a piano, but there's only one way for it to be a piano that plays and works right? So we have to find that one way. Paradigm shifting, which just changes the narrative and everything that we work on. The road unknown, which is taking the less common route. And trend setting, which is getting ahead of the trend and setting a new direction for the trends that we've hunted down. We use Ev Rogers' diffusion of innovation to guide all of these principles, understanding where critical mass reaches and trying to always stick to this innovative end of the curve and, get ahead of even the early adopters in the work that we do. We look at historical models such as Laver's Law, which posit a 150-year cycle of fashion, which is no longer even close to being relevant. Sometimes I feel like it's 150 seconds. Actually, Kurt Anderson posited that the evolution of style has come to an end. And I always like to share this slide because if you look at the difference from a car or the way of dress or hairstyling from the 1930s to the 1950s, which is a 20-year period, you can easily tell the difference between those eras. Same from the 1950s to the 70s, and the 70s to the 90s. But around 1990s, something particular started to change where distinctions from one era to the next became less and less pronounced. Whereas to the current day, you couldn't necessarily point out someone in the 1990s wearing a t-shirt and jeans was wearing the same t-shirt and jeans today. There are points of deviation, but even those have come back into the cycle at a more rapid pace. And we see this in things like 4 franchises of Spider-Man movies in the last 20 years, right? Same thing with Batman, right? So this is a common practice. And then the second half of our process deals with brand strategy, which is the super fast forwarded section, which I'll go through. And here, people always ask, why are we looking at this image? And I ask my students this, even when I'm teaching this, and it has to do with this terracotta vase that features these figures. And these are God figures from ancient Greece. And God stood as the original notion of brand conceptualization. So here we see that perhaps Athena or Hera or one of the gods, stands for a particular notion of femininity or power, whether it be war or beauty, right? So we look at these brands and we decide how we want to develop these brands. We have brand identity, we have brand personality and brand image, which come in the form of market positioning, vision, mission, value proposition, and then brand definition. We use brand archetypes to develop our brands, from rulers and artists, innocent sage, explorers and rebels. And these are all character archetypes that you'll find in the stories of Lewis Carroll. So all of this is ways of building narrative, which again, I take strongly from the work of Carroll and the work that I produce. Brand identity, brand image, and brand personality. Persona, a lot of the characters were representative of real-life figures, so they became fantastic personas that were extremely boisterous or lunatic in the books, especially within the Alice stories. We use narrative formats, the Aristotelian one being BME, beginning, middle, and end. We use Freytag's pyramid, starting with an exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement. We use the story spine of Ken Adams, which is popular with the folks over at Pixar. And then we go into the creative and we look at how a lot of the work of Lewis Carroll was based in the use of the surreal. So whether it's running in motion or falling in perpetuity or growing in size in proportion to the world around you or just nonsense talking, these creative source of inspirations which were sourced from the real world then take on an exaggerated form, which makes the stories fantastic and entertaining, right? So there are internal and external sources of creativity, internal sources coming from the brain, internalized archetypes that live within the brain beyond the character archetypes that we just discussed, universal archetypes, and then spontaneous innovation and synthesis of thoughts to create new ideas. Universal archetypes including shapes and forms in Aristotelian sense, squares, circles, triangles, so on and so forth. Objective social forms and archetypes, universal facial response, facial recognition, and emotional response that correlate with these. And then again, coming back to the brand archetypes, external being the world around us, taking everything from the grass and the ground to the earth, wind, and fire as a source of inspiration. Society as a whole being a constant source of inspiration. And then we take culture as a source of inspiration. Dwight McDonald was a prominent communications theorist who developed the notions of mass cult and mid cult as they stood as opposed to folk culture, high culture. Commercial culture is the current day representative of that. And we understand these to be folk culture being derived from the real world, high culture being a refinement of that, and commercial culture being a vulgarization of either of those in an effort to make profits. And we discuss the world as a place where it once was all created by hand. Today, handcrafted elements of our society are privileged and treated as if they have a specific level of value because human hands have created them as opposed to machines. So we tend to think about what would the world be like if it was all created by hand. What did that mean for those people where everything had a connection to another human being's existence as opposed to just machines, or as opposed to someone just making money where there was passion behind craft and art. So the grandfather clock being a representative of folk culture, historic references that we take from ancient Greece, from ancient Egypt, and we see those manifested in the real world today, from ancient Rome, and we see this manifested in the real world today, from ancient China, and we see these same concepts being articulated in different forms in the modern world, and from all over the world, including Native American Mycenae, again, being manifested in the real world. Design motifs that we study and we take note of, how these are used in the real world. Middle Ages coming to the current world in different forms. And then the Industrial Revolution being a watershed moment for change in Western society and the world at large, and how these again come up into play. High culture in the 19th century, leading to high culture in the 20th century, cafe society, and then how these works are eventually to become derivative in the modern day world. You see here Scott Fitzgerald's Beautiful in the Dam, used by G-Eazy and is Beautiful in the Dam tour, which had little to do with the characters of cafe society that Fitzgerald was speaking of. And going on and on about how folk culture and commercial culture came into prominence in the 20th century. And all these things led us in the current direction that we're in. 20th century popular culture manifests itself in the 21st century. In even its most reductive forms, it's become identifiable. And I'd like to think that many of Lewis Carroll's characters could be so reductive and still be identifiable in his day and age with the popularity of his work. And we have street artists like Banksy who oppose and challenge conventional social norms. And we look at how different strategies, and this is when we come back to the full core scope of Lewis Carroll and the surrealism, how in the advertising world, we seek to perform, inform, persuade, and entertain. We use different models such as elaboration, likelihood model to achieve that. And the author's purpose is seen in these different capacities. For instance, with this beer ad, to persuade, using facts and logic, in this BMW ad to inform, using pure information to develop details. or to entertain is in this Geico ad. And they have us all say 15% in like 15 minutes or less, right? But here you see the Geico lizard with Thanos's Infinity Gauntlet with all 6 stones. And then we take it back to the work of Salvador Dali with The Persistence of Memory, followed by The Temptation of Saint Anthony, and we see the surreal. And then we see how this is played out in the advertising world in various forms, again and again and again and again and again, right? And agencies such as IDEO have become infamous in their development of approaches such as design thinking and how these have been influential in the use of things like surreal. 2-Bit Circus is also a company who delves into the surreal and bringing surreal elements into real life in some of the productions that they create. And the World Maker Fairs are famous for this type of thinking outside the box. So there are many spaces that are not necessarily dedicated to the work of Lewis Carroll, as in my agency, who are definitely informed by his life and his work and the things he's created. And then we also like to promote in my agency the notion of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, which is a hot topic right now. And, we take this as being part of, the same trajectory and lineage, in that Carroll in his work represented, broad swathes of characters and personality types. And we entertain these notions as part of the same, suffice it to say, a paradigm of thinking, from left brain thinking and right brain thinking, and the connectivity that exists between them along those hemispheres. So that's what I have. I think I made it through 100 and some odd slides.
Hey, thank you very much. An immediate question that kind of springs to mind is, you entered the Wonderland Award 4 times, so you had a really in-depth and intimate engagement with the world of Lewis Carroll as a student and sort of working with the collection and his world, but you also sort of have this career now as a teacher, but also as a creative maker. So do you think about Carroll differently now than you did then, since you're sort of approaching those from sort of completely different realms?
I do in those specific realms. So in academia, yes, it's a different level of thinking. It's more specific to, like I introduced the notion of historic references, right? So things like that. And the advertising is more to do with like the surreal, right? And then I've used the work that I did in Wonderland Awards as a precursor to my life's work currently, which is beyond everything that I just mentioned. As you can see, this is the Mighty Mighty Snack Box Brigade, is the children's entertainment brand that I've created. So it's a series of novels. And as you see, I'm a recording artist, engineer, and producer. So I've composed a whole series of children's music and developing illustrations and animations to accompany this with the merchandise and everything. So it's very much a part of my existence on a day-to-day basis, if that answers your question.
It does, thank you. And I believe we have all 3 of you here still. So I think as we conclude this session, we'll soon see a gallery of this year's Wonderland entries. And I wonder, like, now that you all have a little bit of distance from your time as undergraduates and students at USC and working in the submitting to the award, like, what would you say to students now first encountering the world of Lewis Carroll through the collection or otherwise? And Genevieve, you're smiling and laughing, so I'm gonna pick on you first.
I think one of the things that was really exciting for me was actually going to the special collections and like going through the Lewis Carroll collection and looking at all the books and texts and weird oddities. So that was really how I got inspired to create my own weird little book. So I think that would be my suggestion, is like, go to the library, start there, and see what happens next. I think like seeing other people's creativity always inspires me to be more creative too. So it was just great to see examples and possibilities.
Thank you for that library plug. That was not planned, but thank you. And STYLÉS, let's go back to you. What would you say to students currently coming through USC?
I think the thing that inspired me to, or the way I learned about the Wonderland Awards was through the Academy for Polymathic Study at the USC Libraries. So join that. there are rich conversations and dialogues that take place that, I mean, can inspire you on multiple levels, whether it's academically or creatively.
Thank you, and thanks for that plug for the Academy. That's great too. And now, AROUSSIAK, we're coming all the way back to you, and now you've got to work in a library plug too. How would you answer that? How would you introduce students today to the world of Lewis Carroll?
Well, there's the amazing Cassidy collection at the library. And then the library itself, I think, again, to go back to the kind of creative process of being inspired by contexts and architectural details and spaces and environments, just kind of exploring. There's so many nooks and crannies in the library, so many secret spaces. You can kind of have your imagination run wild in terms of what you can do in that space and how you can kind of respond or integrate elements from it into your work.
Well, thank you all. I mean, it's so often students come and and spend their time here, their 4 years or other periods for graduate degrees, and then we don't get to see the sort of longer term ways that their time here has informed what they're doing. So it's really inspiring, and we're really grateful that you shared with us where you've been in the days since. So thank you all for joining us. It's really terrific. So now we're going to transition to this year's Wonderland Award entries. And most folks who joined us last year may remember that we had some 3D sort of immersive galleries for you to explore those in before we begin the ceremony at 5 o'clock. And I'm going to turn it over to Tyson to lead that portion of the program. So Tyson, it's all you.
Sure. But before we start, did we have any questions from the audience for AROUSSIAK, Genevieve, and STYLÉS? Hugh, I know you asked some, but did you ask if anyone else had any? Because it's 4:19. I think we still had a few more minutes before we went on.
Sure. I didn't see any, but sure, if folks have some, that'd be great.
I've got one for Genevieve, actually. So when I didn't quite get from your presentation, when you're creating your remarkable works, do you, and I wasn't sure if you sold all of them or if for some of them you say, oh, wow, that is really cool, I'm keeping that.
Let's see, that's a great question. I think the one short answer is like, I have not yet, as somebody who creates art, figured out how to sell it beyond poetry. So like that's my own personal, like, I don't quite know what I'm doing in terms of pursuing that as a venue. So I would say that most of these, I mean, I'm creating them because of the impulse to create and because I want to, and because I want an object to look at. So I have not sold any of these. I did start an Etsy shop during the pandemic, because what else are we doing during the pandemic? So I do sell the coasters. I sell the poetry coasters. So if anybody wants, woe glue, you can hit me up. But otherwise, like these objects, most of them are one of a kind. A few of them, like the book with the little cards that get shuffled around, that is something that I have made in editions, and I have occasionally sold it when people have approached me for it. But pretty much I'm making these for myself, and most of them are sort of one of a kind little things that live behind me in my office.
Okay,
Thank you for asking.
Do you think you can post in the chat the name of your Etsy shop so that people can navigate to that? Thanks. Did anyone else have something for the three of them? I think it was a lot to take on. I mean, it's a lot to process, but it looks like
It's Peter.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention to Genevieve that she inspired me to remember an event that happened to me quite a few years ago in Oakland, right next to Berkeley. I was visiting John Warnock at the Adobe headquarters in Oakland. And even though he was dealing primarily with digital, he had a book collection, a really interesting book collection. And the book that he treasured the most that he wanted to share with me was a book produced in the 18th century, late in the 18th century in France. And it was a book made up of 24 pages, which were woven in very, very fine silk on a jacquard loom. It's a beautiful book. There are a few copies. There's one in Marin County. There's one in Oakland, apparently. And what he really liked about it was that it was the first digitally produced book. And so when I saw you're working with fabric and your crocheting and your fabric work, I said, my goodness, she's inventing it in a way without any reference to what happened in the 18th century. I'm quite confident, but I just love seeing that continuity in creative productivity in books.
Yeah.
Karen, you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't find my mute button. It was fascinating looking at these three different disparate individuals and their creativity as students, and then to see how this creativity is just blossoming, 5 years, 10 years afterwards. I mean, it's just amazing. And just continuing with the last one, we're dealing with the printing. Berkeley puts on codex every 2 years, and that's fascinating. I'm sure they would love to, or if you haven't been there, to participate in that, you would find it fascinating, Genevieve. Just lovely.
Thank you. Michaela, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I'm wondering if any of the three of you, but specifically Genevieve, had thought about the really physical connections between particularly weaving and text. So this is something that I'm very interested in my own scholarship, the connection between, for example, the cotton industry and how that helped produce the subsequent or help support the subsequent printing industry, particularly in the 18th century, but also thinking about knitting. So I'm a knitter, not a crocheter, but in knitting, I've thought a lot about and written some about how it is essentially a text, and you can read sweaters that we, like Aran sweaters, we don't have patterns for as their own text. And it's also a binary code. So I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts on like garments also. It's a very disheveled question, but.
Who wants to field that? Genevieve, did you want to take a stab at that?
I'm very excited about Michaela's question, and also the fact that she's doing research on textiles and thinking about text through textile, which I think is super fascinating. It is something that I have started to do some research in, but basically I don't work at a university, so I'm an independent scholar, which means like everything takes 400 years longer than it should. So I have not I have not written anything that is for consumption on that at this point yet, but there are so many fascinating articles, and I feel like more work needs to be done in this field. So Michaela, if you have published some stuff, please send it my way, send it in the chat or email me. I would love to read more about it, and I'm happy to share some resources with you too.
This is completely tangential, but speaking of garments, there wasn't enough time to go through this one project, but this is a wearable garden that I've designed using felt-based fabric to actually seed plants into, using hydroponics to kind of grow them. So in case it's of interest, I put it in the chat, the link to it.
So
that's absolutely of interest. Please put it in the chat.
That reminds me, a couple years ago, some students approached us and asked if they could create some artwork in the library where, and I'm a little fuzzy now on the details, no pun intended, but they would like paint some kind of organic material that would then grow, and it would, create some kind of message. And in theory, that sounds great, but maybe not in a library, So we did have to turn that one down. But, in an outdoor space, for instance, that could be a really cool installation. So I love the concept of the living coat there that you mentioned. One last plug for the three of them, because we are going to move on in just a second. We are belatedly working on on a large site that will have all of our Wonderland Award submitters from past years, all of them together, and then you'll be able to see all of their submissions, including not just Styles's artworks, but I mean, Stylus, some of your submissions were like 150 pages long. I don't know how you did that. And went to school here, you know, seriously, 4 years running. I mean, it was really insane. So you just created entire worlds there every year, and it was amazing. So if that's it, Anne-Marie and I, thank you again, AROUSSIAK, Stylus, and Genevieve, and Anne-Marie and I will go ahead and move on to the next one. Let me just check the, oh wait, Mark Richards had a question. Are you still finding time for writing poetry, or have your other ventures taken over?
Yeah, I'm still
Answer
writing
that?
poetry. Yeah, I'm still writing poetry. Lots and lots of poetry.
Excellent.